If you were to strip away your name, your memories, and the language you speak, a quiet, unsettling question remains waiting in the dark. It is a question about the map of your internal world. If you look at a globe, lines are drawn across continents, separating nations, laws, and currencies. But there are other lines, invisible yet far more rigid, that divide the human mind. If you were born just a few hundred miles to the east or west of your actual birthplace, the entity you pray to, the moral code you would defend to the death, and the vision of the afterlife that comforts you in moments of grief would be entirely different. Your deepest, most sacred convictions, the ones you feel in the center of your chest as absolute, objective truth, are largely a function of your geographical coordinates. We tend to view our spiritual orientation as a profound, personal choice, or a deliberate response to a divine calling. But when looked at through the lens of history and neuroscience, an uncomfortable pattern emerges. A pattern that suggests our relationship with the cosmos is not an intimate dialogue with the infinite, but an accident of birth. And once you notice how perfectly the boundaries of eternal truth align with political borders, the illusion of certainty begins to fracture. We are taught from a very early age that truth is singular. Across cultures, the dominant narratives of faith present themselves not as regional perspectives, but as universal realities. The official story is elegant in its simplicity. It tells us that a creator, or an ultimate cosmic order, revealed itself at a specific point in human history. From that single point of origin, the truth was meant to radiate outward, a light meant to illuminate all of humanity. In this worldview, the geographical spread of a belief system is viewed as a triumph of truth over ignorance, a natural expansion of a message so inherently profound that it captivates anyone who hears it. The believer is encouraged to feel a deep sense of gratitude, believing they have been uniquely positioned to receive this unadulterated reality. They look at their community, their rituals, and their sacred texts, and they see a direct, unbroken line connecting their daily lives to the absolute source of existence. It feels objective. It feels designed. It feels like home. This is the narrative that sustains civilizations, builds cathedrals, and writes laws. It relies entirely on the comforting assumption that your culture did not invent its gods, but was simply chosen by them. But if we step back and look at the global landscape with clinical detachment, the official story begins to collide with a devastating geographical reality. For thousands of years, human populations existed in profound isolation. When the foundations of the world's major religions were being laid in the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia, entire civilizations in the Americas, the Pacific, and sub-Saharan Africa lived, breathed, and died in complete ignorance of these revelations. If a specific theological doctrine is essential for the salvation of the human soul, the historical silence of that doctrine, across vast swaths of the earth, presents a severe ethical and logical paradox. For over 15 centuries, millions of individuals lived and died in Mesoamerica without ever hearing a single verse of the Torah, the New Testament, or the Quran. They did not reject these messages. They were physically incapable of receiving them because the oceans functioned as absolute barriers to the transmission of information. If divine truth requires a human messenger to cross an ocean on a wooden ship to be known, then that truth is subject to the laws of geography, not divinity. It implies that for vast stretches of human history, the eternal destiny of an individual was determined entirely by a continental divide they had no hand in creating. This geographic distribution becomes even more precise when you analyze the phenomenon of linguistic drift and cultural isolation. Religion does not exist in a vacuum. It travels along trade routes, stops at military borders, and adapts to the local ecology. The gods of the desert reflect the scarcity of water, the severity of the sun, and the hierarchical structure of nomadic tribes. The gods of the forest reflect the cycles of decay, rebirth, and the interconnectedness of the canopy. When a religion crosses a mountain range or a body of water, it must be translated into the local vernacular. In that translation, the original meaning is often lost, rewritten to fit the psychological needs of the new host population. What we find when we map the history of belief is not a uniform, universal revelation expanding smoothly across the earth, but a series of highly localized psychological adaptations. The human mind, when faced with the terrifying vastness of existence, uses whatever cultural materials are within arm's reach to construct a shelter. If those materials happen to be the myths of ancient Mesopotamia, the philosophy of Vedic India, or the ancestral traditions of the Andes, the brain treats them with the exact same level of absolute, unshakable certainty. To understand why the brain is so vulnerable to this geographic lottery, we must look at the neurotheology of early childhood development. The human brain is born profoundly unfinished. Unlike other primates, our neural architecture is sculpted by the environment we are exposed to during our first years of life. This is an evolutionary survival strategy. It allows a human child to adapt to the specific demands of an Arctic tundra, an African savanna, or a dense urban environment. But this neuroplasticity comes with a profound vulnerability. The language we hear, the moral frameworks we are taught, and the supernatural narratives of our tribe are wired directly into our limbic system, long before our prefrontal cortex develops the capacity for critical, analytical thought. By the time a child reaches adolescence, their brain has already built deep, structural neural pathways that equate the local religious narrative with safety, belonging, and existential security. When an adult experiences a profound spiritual awakening or a feeling of divine presence, the brain interprets that raw, neurological event using the vocabulary it was given in childhood. A Christian sees Christ, a Hindu sees Krishna, and a Buddhist experiences the dissolution of the self. The underlying neurological mechanism is identical. The cultural clothing it wears is determined entirely by the zip code of the hospital where they were born. This is where dark behavioral economics enters the equation. Religious institutions have intuitively understood this psychological vulnerability for millennia. To survive and expand, an ideology must create mechanisms that ensure its replication across generations, regardless of the objective truth of its claims. The most effective way to do this is to institutionalize the geographic accident of birth. By introducing rituals of initiation in infancy, such as baptism or naming ceremonies, the institution stakes a claim on the child's identity before they possess the cognitive tools to assent or object. Furthermore, institutions create powerful social and economic incentives to maintain the local consensus. In many historical and modern societies, apostasy, the act of walking away from the regional faith, carries severe penalties, ranging from social ostracization and economic ruin to physical death. The human brain, which evolved in small tribal groups where exile meant certain death, is terrified of social isolation. We are biologically incentivized to believe what our neighbors believe, because the cost of nonconformity is too high. The geographic uniformity of belief within a region is not a proof of the religion's validity. It is evidence of the terrifying efficiency of social conformity and institutional survival strategies. The implications of this reality are deeply destabilizing. If you are a believer, you must confront a mathematical truth that is difficult to reconcile with the concept of a just and universal deity. If your faith is the one true path, then the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived were doomed from conception, simply because they were born in the wrong valley, on the wrong side of the river, or in the wrong century. You are forced to believe that the creator of the universe possesses an extraordinary preference for specific geographic coordinates and a profound indifference toward others. Conversely, if you look at the situation with absolute objectivity, you realize that if you had been adopted at birth by a family living in a different hemisphere, you would currently view your present beliefs with the same mixture of pity, confusion, or hostility that you currently direct toward foreign traditions. Your sense of certainty is not a cosmic validation. It is a psychological echo of your environment. When we look closely at the architecture of human civilization, we see that our maps of the divine are mirrors of our geography. We have mistaken the boundary lines of our empires and our cultures for the contours of the cosmos. We have taken the local dialect of our ancestors and assumed it was the native tongue of the Creator. This realization does not necessarily mean that there is nothing beyond the material world, or that the human search for meaning is entirely futile. But it does mean that the structures we have built to contain that meaning are deeply flawed, human fabrications. They are regional fortresses built to protect us from the cold, indifferent silence of the universe. And once you see the walls of that fortress for what they are, just stones piled high by frightened people who happen to live on this specific patch of earth, it becomes impossible to look at your own certainty the same way again. You are left standing in the open air, looking up at a sky that has no borders, no favorites, and no language. The absolute truth you were promised dissolves into something much larger and much more silent. You are left with the quiet, haunting realization that the only thing separating your soul from the soul of a stranger is a line drawn in the dirt.